switch standards and let's talk about the viral, evolution of things. So where is HTML5 headed beyond the browser? We know that there's just an incredible amount of devices just over the horizon, almost literally, that are going to be released upon us, and many of them are not going to have browsers. So does HTML5 have something to say? You guys certainly are using HTML5 outside of the traditional browser context, but where do you see and we mean this by the whole suite of technology, the JavaScript, the CSS, and the presentational markup, but where's the evolution beyond the browser?
So we actually have kind of evolved past the browser, but really we are just creating a browser, right? It's an installable browser that has our game code and assets along with it. So it's not really outside of the browser. It is a browser.
It's just not using self-hosted web application.
Pretty much,
It's an interesting definition, though, that you're using of browser, because most people would suggest that a browser is something the user is in control of their navigation.
There are some funny side effects.
You've got kind of a restricted browser in that sense.
There's some funny side effects. That's okay.
There really are.
Don't often need someone. Don't play it. You can
so we use WebKit to wrap up our applications using Node WebKit, which is actually an Intel open source initiative. And it is a complete browser, but your average user doesn't know. The tens of thousands of Steam players who play it, they don't know, they don't care, right? But we see some bugs come up. For example, one that was very surprising recently is you can take an image file from your computer, from anywhere, from a browser, from Windows Explorer, Finder, it doesn't matter. You can drag it into our application, a wizard's lizard, and it will open the image, because that's the default behavior of WebKit, which is completely unexpected and not desired, and it actually brought up an issue. I mean, it's easy to prevent, right? There's a file API, we just cancel the event, easy peasy, right? But there's about this big of a feature set that WebKit supports, and we're using about this. We want canvas, we want to draw pixels to the screen. We want to register input via the keyboard, the mouse, gamepad, we want to play some sounds. That's about it. That's all that we're using. And so taking the web outside of the browser, kind of the way that we're going is we really want something like SDL with JavaScript plugged into it. So like SDL combined with V8.
For the benefit of everyone, SDL is?
Standard graphics library. I don't know what that actually stands
Simple
for.
direct layer.
There you go.
Basically, it's like a C++ library that allows you to interact with OpenGL and other graphics technologies, and it's supposed to kind of flatten it out across Windows, OS X, and Linux.
So you're flattening out a technology that's meant to flatten out hardware. just checking there.
Well, flattening out, we're abstracting it for our own usage, right? Being JavaScript developers, I don't want to write C, right? And I don't want to have to compile my application for C using Microsoft Visual Studio and then compile it again on Linux using GCC and then whatever, right? I want to be able to deploy my application against something that's already kind of pre-compiled for me.
In all fairness, probably the average AOL dial-up user thinks that the application they're provided is also a browser, but I think most people would agree that's sort of an abuse of the term. So pushing back a little bit, I think it's an abuse of the term to say because you are hosting a WebKit thing that you've made some sort of, installable, customized browser. In a sense, you've used it as a presentation layer, which is fine. I'm not criticizing it, but I don't think it's a browser. So I mean beyond when I say beyond browser, I mean beyond the traditional idea that I see a page, I click on a link and I navigate to some other page, I see URLs, I can link to unique individual states of content. That's not something that you commonly see in games, that you can link back to a particular stage in the game.
It's not the web, it's web technology being used for not the purposes that you're talking about, right? I mean, it could be, like, our games would work on the web. We could put them at a URL and it would function just the same. The reason we do what we do is largely a monetization distribution problem.
So what is this technology going to have to say, if anything, when there is no screen? On devices that are connected, the Internet of Things and all that, when there is no screen, it seems like the core foundational technologies of the web still have an important role to play. And what is that role? Is that role going to evolve beyond the standards processes that we were just whining about? Or does it evolve?
Well, you're talking about HTML5 without the HTML and without the CSS.
I guess I'm talking about it without the presentational nature, but HTML5, for instance,
so you're talking about
has an awful lot to say about semantic markup and data, and we have microdata formats buried inside of HTML5.
So JavaScript plus the web sockets, the local storage, it's
like JavaScript plus all these great APIs that come with it, probably.
But how is that any different?
It becomes an informational web, an informational.
So it's connected. It's a language which is intrinsically connected. Possibly.
I think the benefits would be that it's a common language that many, many developers know, right?
Is it a common language or is it the lowest common denominator?
Well, that's fine too. Lowest common denominator.
Whatever. I'm easy.
It gets a lot of us paid, right?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be the fanciest thing in the world, right?
Yeah, but so what about the future? Is it like, do we keep going down this path? It seems like JavaScript, HTML5, CSS is the thing that is sort of, it is the lowest common denominator, in my view anyway.
Yeah.
And it's every platform will have a renderer and an interpreter for JavaScript and CSS, other way around. But is that where we want to go? Or do we do the thing like Apple did with Flash and just go, okay, no, that's it. Let's do something different. Or let's do JavaScript 2.0 or HTML5.
I'm not sure that CSS is necessarily quite as ubiquitous as JavaScript. CSS is certainly ubiquitous in the browser, but in a lot of other cases, like for instance WebGL, you're not really using CSS to style the graphics, the direct graphics that you're using, right? So,
True, because
maybe
you've
CSS
got the canvas
is a slightly
and off you go.
less fair comparison. We can talk about the ubiquity
All right,
of
so
JavaScript.
trim out the CSS in this part of it, and trim out the DOM, for instance, then, apart from whatever you use to...
The DOM in terms of presentation, yes, but the DOM in terms of organization of information, I think not. I think actually it plays a very important role in the semantic description of data as it goes across the web.
It depends what your aims are. Like for our instances, we don't use DOM markup at all because we're not trying to convey that sort of information to something that would consume it.
Rendering. When would you use the DOM for data storage or
All the micro formats, for example, is what I'm thinking of.
Oh yeah, all right.
So semantically marking up that data so that we have this dream of the semantic web enabling itself, right?
So it's kind of like it's almost like you're talking about XML, right? You'd have a connected device.
Oh God, no! Please, please don't put that as a quote out. That's no.
But that's essentially the concept you're talking about, right? You're talking about devices that have no graphical user interface that communicate to each other over, this standard markup language, right? They transmit data via maybe REST APIs or whatever, but the way that they consume the data, it's structured in a way that's following, the element, attributes, content.
So we're using a technology which was developed to render documents to now run applications.
The DOM seems way too bloated for this use case.
Doesn't it seem a bit nuts? Doesn't it seem a point where, okay, enough, let's try something else?
It's exactly the same as biological evolution, though. I was watching a show recently that was demonstrating that the human eyeball is better suited to be underwater. It's not actually a very good instrument for seeing the light out in the air in the open world.
Especially when you get older.
When I'm underwater, everything's blurry.
But I might be wrong about that. But the point remains. The point remains that evolution moves forward.
My point was,
evolution uses what it has. It builds on top of. It doesn't go backwards. Unless there's a mutation.
But it also uses survival of the fittest.
I think to that point, the ubiquity of the web technologies now makes them the de facto path forward into all these other things. Whether or not you would have set out 20 years ago to say HTML is the right format is kind of an irrelevant moot point.
It has survived.
It's the cockroach.
Still here.
It is and cockroaches are very biologically successful, right? They're everywhere.
HTML5 is a cockroach.
maybe just JavaScript. I'm not going to say that markup is going to survive forever, right? Especially HTML specific. Maybe it won't. JavaScript though is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's being more and more embeddable. You can code JavaScript in Photoshop. You can code it on Arduinos now. And it's wherever it's not available, there is someone right now that's like, oh, there's not a node blank.
But is that
they're working on.
Is that a natural evolution, or is that something that's been artificially inserted into it?
They do say necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So
yeah, but
the need is there. The need is present, clearly.
But is there a need, or is it companies that have decided we need to have it here?
No, I think if you look at the node ecosystem, somebody said we need to create a way to connect to serial ports, and that opened up the entire realm of controlling robots with JavaScript because somebody said we need to write. In fact, Chris Williams, shout out to him. Chris Williams wrote node serial port because the need was there.
Right.
I think most of what we see in that ecosystem comes from the need. However niche that need may be, it's a need nonetheless.
And Node itself kind of came out of that, right?
What's that?
Well, I'd say like Node kind of came out of that similar thing where it was someone that said, hey, I think I like the way that JavaScript does I/O, and I want to bring that paradigm to the server. It's not that it didn't exist in like things like Tornado or whatever, right?
I think actually the story was, I want to bring that model of I/O to the server, and oh, hey, JavaScript is a pretty convenient choice. That's actually how Ryan evolved to Node.js. But yeah, it was sort of a happy accident. In fact, I think the history of JavaScript over 19 years is that happy accident. When Brendan Eich invented it as a 10-day prototype at Netscape in May of '95, there's no way he could have dreamed that JavaScript would be embedded inside of light bulbs. Nonetheless, it clearly has won that ubiquity war. Does it serve us better to bellyache and complain that it isn't the perfect technology that maybe any of us would have set out to design, or does it serve us better to say there has to be some accidental genius involved because no other technology won and a lot of them tried?
You're talking intelligent design on JavaScript. Why don't we turn this around? What's your biggest problem with JavaScript?
Module system.
Extensibility.
Explain. What do you mean the module
Requiring files, dependencies.
Just code organization in JavaScript is pretty terrible. I mean,
other languages take it for granted.
You know, like
so easy, define, done.
Yeah. Being able to isolate your code into like logical components and then reuse those components across a number of different places in your code is difficult with JavaScript.
I think we can basically boil that down to the presence of the global object in the program is the problem. It is the gateway by which we got all of these bastardized organization approaches, right? But thankfully, ES6 has a pretty strong solution to that. It's coming soon. Right. It's been hotly debated, but ES6 module support. So that's a great example.
It makes the argument that we should be moving forward. And I think another thing I wanted to mention was that there's an article by Joe Spolsky, and he talks about how the worst thing you can do is rewrite it from scratch, because you have value in a thing that you've spent time working on and curating. Even though it might have warts and it might have quirks, it still has a lot of value because anything that solves problems that is in use is going to have little things about it, the edge cases, like bad parts of the code, because of the fact that it's battle tested, right? And so starting from scratch and saying like, let's throw out JavaScript and like make something new kind of just throws away all the value that JavaScript has right now, which is the ubiquity, the fact that there are a lot of implementations and it can be embedded this way and that way. And the best solution is to keep moving forward with the spec of JavaScript and HTML5 and just make that better.
That might be why we've seen Google try really hard with Dart for years now. They're Dart, Dart, Dart. I haven't seen a big response to it. I'm sure there's developers out there who love it and are using it, but I think that's an uphill battle. What they really want to do is they want to get your average web developer to switch from JavaScript to Dart. I don't see that happening because it goes against evolution. JavaScript has crazy momentum. A lot of people know it, familiarity. You know the commands, you know the syntax, and like Geoff is saying, if you want to undo that, you undo 20 years of work, right?
I think also there's a pretty high switching cost. It's a very non-zero cost for any other browser to implement the Dart VM. And Brendan Eich, for all purposes, he's on record as saying that cost is too high. That's why that battle.
And what's the benefit? What's the benefit to Mozilla to implement Dart?
Well, what do they get out of it?
They're pretty heavily invested in the future of JavaScript, being that they employ a lot of people that actually control the future of the language.
So it's about incentives, right?
Right.
And you're never going to have one party that's like, hey, I'm going to replace the ubiquitous web browser language, and I'm going to control it. And that goes against the nature of the web.
In a sense, the drive and the desire to make something better than JavaScript is not on its surface a bad goal. I think it's what drives the spec. The standards body, the TC39 body themselves, is they want to make something better, bigger, more widespread, more ubiquitous. So I think that drive is good, and I think what we really could complain about is the way they went about it. They certainly are on record as going about it sort of underhandedly. They accidentally released the memo, that Dart was going to come, and there's been a mixture of messages. Is it Dart replacing JavaScript or Dart being a better compiled to JavaScript language? And nobody really knows exactly what the grand vision and goal is. So Dart's definitely got a lot of problems, but it's only one in a whole line of other technologies that are trying to push the standard forward. CoffeeScript being a notable example from several years back. Most of the great stuff that we're getting in ES6 came because we were informed by the experiments with CoffeeScript, and I expect that to continue. TypeScript is another perfect example of experiments on top of the language that are then going to filter into the language. There's clear record that many of the things that they've experimented with there are influencing where the future of the language is going. So it doesn't have to be proprietary lock-in to evolve. It just happens to be that was Google's choice with Dart. But that's one example, and there are several other counterexamples that have pushed the language forward.
So Carl, you teach JavaScript. You're deep into JavaScript.
Fair bias, absolutely.
You live, eat, and breathe it. So what would you change? What would you evolve it to?
The biggest thing I would change about JavaScript is get rid of completely every essence of classes, because class design is inappropriate for JavaScript.
Because it's a functional language?
Not because it's a functional language. JavaScript has this thing called delegation, which if you embrace the nature of delegation, it's a more powerful mechanism than inheritance ever could dream to be. And instead, we've been spending all this time and effort to bring the old school 20-year-old mentality of classes and inheritance and composition and mix-ins on top of the language and not embracing the way it naturally works.
So you wouldn't change the language, you'd change the programmer.
I would change, in particular respect to ES6, the one thing that I think is a terrible idea that I would totally get rid of is the idea that they're bringing class syntax to the language.
So what do you think about prototypes? Are you talking about classical inheritance, or are you talking about prototype inheritance?
I think prototype inheritance is completely the wrong label, because it's actually like saying a red-orange. Call it an apple, it's not a red-orange. So prototypal inheritance is a nonsense term to me. The prototype mechanism is delegation, and I think we should embrace that. We should get rid of all this notion of putting classes and inheritance on top of that, because that's not how JavaScript was ever designed to work. And in fact, it doesn't even match with the real world. The real world doesn't work in classifications for the most part. It actually works more like the prototype mechanism.
It's interesting you talk about that. And one of the reasons that we love JavaScript is because as game developers, a very strong paradigm in the game development world is called entity component. An entity component basically takes away the need for classes, and you compose your game objects of properties. So for example, you might have a game object that needs to have a position. And so position is a component on this entity, and the size and collision properties and all these things, and you compose your objects based on the things that they need, not through some inheritance chain.
So you're talking about aggregation instead of inheritance.
So that's
composition over inheritance.
Yeah, that's the new thing in the class world, is that composition, we never should have done inheritance, we should only do composition. But even that, I think, misses the point of JavaScript, which is delegation. The idea that two objects can be linked through delegation, and you have virtual composition instead of forced composition. You don't have to copy things together, you can simply allow them to be linked together through these live delegation links. So with respect to your question, that's, I think, what's getting us most off track, is this foolhardy attempt to go down the world of classes and design our software with classes.
What about type safety? Do you see any need to enforce any sort of type safety to help with debugging, to help with those little bugs that you just can't find?
I'm going to answer for it.
He's going to delegate.
Let me take this
I'm going to delegate. I would say no. And the reason I say that is because having written
Because real programmers don't type safe?
No, it's not that. It's that the problems I run into, the hardest problems I have to solve, the hardest bugs I have to solve are never type inference problems. Yeah, I get bit by them once in a while, but they're a trivial matter to fix, and they're mostly like, damn it, okay, fixed.
I would argue that it isn't a trivial matter for most developers. I hear a lot of stories that type issues become those sorts of...
So first of all, we need to actually clarify the fact that two different people mean entirely different things by the word type. So there's a loose definition of the word type, which means a value that has intrinsic behavior. And there's a much more rigid definition of type that somebody like a Haskell developer would have, which embodies an awful lot more behavior along with that value and with that value type. So JavaScript's view of things is that a type, JavaScript does have types. It has Boolean and number and so forth. It has intrinsic built-in behaviors that the number 42 and the string 42 behave differently. So there's a well-defined set of rules that talk about how those values coerce to each other. And that's what most people get mad about.
So you're talking about type coercion, right?
Most people get mad about implicit coercion.
Right.
But it's actually a very simple algorithm. If you just opened up the spec and read the 10 lines, it's an algorithm just like any other piece of code that you've ever written, and it says exactly what to do in all those combinations. So I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about the type system because there are corner cases which are really good to sort of, look how stupid JavaScript is because this equals this and that's dumb. But actually in the real world, I would concur with him that most of my problems are just me doing stupid things with code. They have nothing to do with the fact that my Boolean became a number or that my number became an array.
So we can go back to the misconception discussion point, which is type safety. JavaScript has types. People think it's a type unsafe language.
It's not a type enforced language. It is a typed language, but not type enforced.
And implicitly and automatically coerced language where it's very lax with things. Although you can be very tight with things as well.
And it turns out there are tools in that spectrum. So TypeScript is an example of the type annotations, and the compiler of TypeScript tries to step in and say, you probably aren't doing something right. There's a lighter weight version of that called restrict mode, which actually is a build time process that takes your code, annotates all of these things that you're doing comparisons, runs real data through them, and complains if you're doing stupid stuff. So my solution is tools, not evolution of the language itself.
So type is not an issue for you?
My solution is whenever I have type problems, I need better and smarter tools, not a better and smarter language.
Okay.
If you think about it, like there's nothing about, like, say, C that is inherently more type safe. It's the compiler that does the type checking for you at compile time that says, hey, you did this wrong, right?
I feel like, I just want to point out, I feel like that's a very JavaScript answer. Put a tool on top of it rather than change the language itself. I like it. Also want to note that JavaScript's like that stupid fly, it just won't go away.